Hello there, and to reiterate the thing that we need to cover at the beginning of every episode in this current series. Time travel is bad, ladies and gentlemen. Don't do it. Do not drink the time travel Kool-Aid, and here's a man that's going to explain the reasons why. That is the so-called Crewman Daniels. We're going to today look at what we know about this future time agent, who he is, where he comes from, what his agenda was, and who was he really. And to be honest, most of that we don't know. Because we don't even know he was actually called Daniels. You really think about it, he infiltrated the crew of the NX-01, somehow, probably by just altering whatever in Starfleet because future tech, but he called himself Daniels, but he could have assumed someone's identity, put in false information. My guess is, good chance, 50-50 anyway, that he's not even called Daniels. We know he's human, more or less, indicating some of his genetic ancestry to be non-human, but predominantly more human than not, it would appear. He was part of some kind of time agency from the 31st century. Now, he mentions the Temporal Accord. Now, the Temporal Accords, we should stress, is a treaty between the different races and powers that actually have the ability to control time travel. It is not an agency in and of itself. We know that the Temporal Accords have existed from dialogue with Daniels, if we can believe everything that he says, from at least the 27th century, when people who were visiting ancient Earth and watching the pyramids getting built were doing so using the proper procedures, basically following the Temporal Prime Directive of non-interference, something that Daniels himself is kind of breaking at this moment. And as a result, we can assume that probably an agency, he's probably more like a member of the Temporal Integrity Commission, which, if you go back to my video where I covered them in brief, we don't know specifically that the Temporal Integrity Commission was actually part of Starfleet. It could have been a branching agency, a splinter organization, or simply another Federation agency, much like Section 31. It may have started out as Starfleet and went on something else. Daniels himself states that he is not a member of Starfleet, that he is a time agent, and he's involved in the Temporal Cold War. We first meet him in the year, from our perspective, 2151. Now we have to also make some assumptions that the Daniels we encounter chronologically from our point of view is actually the same Daniels we're seeing over and over again. We can assume it probably is because he's familiar with past encounters, but he seems to be moving forward in linear time with the crew of the Enterprise, and that's not necessarily going to be the case. Either just interrupting whatever it is that you were just watching to shamelessly self-promote my own business. Now, for those of you who don't know, me and my partner recently started a small company which is currently online, but we're hoping will lead to our own brand and have its own physical location sometime in the future. At the moment, there are t-shirts, hoodies and other items on there that are both branded from different suppliers, as well as people I've been working with to design our own bespoke design t-shirts and hoodies, some of which were designed by my wife and others again by a third-party artist. And it's all on the website currently now. It is still growing, but any help that you could give, if there's anything on there you like, just going to the website, looking at it, is helping the website get engagement. If there's anything you do happen to like on there, then that will also be fantastic and a great way to support this channel. At the moment, there's nothing particularly on there that is directly linked to this channel, other than the fact that I'm a little different as a person, generally speaking, and I've made a website that reflects something like that of my personality. I don't want to create a brand that's entirely normal, quote unquote, and wanted to go a little different. Now, at the moment, again, it is still in the early stages of its growth, but any help that can be provided by you would be greatly appreciated. And with that said, back to whatever it is you were just watching. He was first encountered in 2151, infiltrating the crew of the Enterprise, where he'd been since launch, hypothetically, assuming he'd not altered people's memories. He was serving as a sort of crewman who served lunch to the captain. He got himself close to Archer, but never did anything to directly intervene. He was there to observe the Cabal and how they were affecting Starfleet and humanity at the time, sort of. He was trying to capture Silic. Now, Silic was working for people who were not capable of time travel, whereas humanity in the Federation of the 31st century was more than capable of controlling it. And he wanted to capture Silic and try to figure out who he was working for. Also, although Daniels did want to keep humanity and Starfleet out of the equation, because it's established that the 22nd century, the mid-22nd century specifically, is a front in the Cold War. It was beginning to affect humans, Klingons and others, and it was probably a logical decision. It was a safer decision to contact humanity, although they were less advanced than, say, the Andorians, the Vulcans, or the Klingons. But at this time they were more level-headed and more trustworthy. He knew, at least dealing with Starfleet, he could tell Starfleet the ins and outs of what was happening, but trust a man with the vaunted reputation of Jonathan Archer and his crew to actually keep his secret and not abuse the information that he's given. To some degree, of course, he was walking a fine line, but with everyone else messing with the timeline, it was mostly damage limitation at this point. We would encounter Daniels several more times throughout time. Again, assuming it's the same person, assuming it's the same chronological order. We encounter him again in 2153, this time trying to prevent Archer from going into the Expanse. He's basically aware that the sphere builders are tampering with the timeline, and he doesn't want them to do that, and he wants Archer to not get involved because he's too important to the timeline. But their tinkering is potentially endangering Archer, which is endangering the existence of the Federation, which is endangering the very thing that was going to stop the sphere builders in the first place. He does all of this, including take Archer into the future to see the Enterprise J. And although he's not persuasive enough to convince Archer to not get involved, he himself won't get directly involved because of Temporal Prime Directive. He has to put his faith in Archer. Later we encounter him again after the Xindi crisis, this time heavily messed up. He has basically thrown the Enterprise back in time. He wants to try and stop Vosk and his sort of followers, who are one of the factions that's puppeting the Temporal Cold War, who've altered Earth. And let's analyze for a second the utter stupidity of Vosk's plan here. His plan was to turn humanity, an already fairly serious threat to his objectives, into an even greater threat. He basically has the Axis powers of the Second World War winning. What would that have done to future events? Humanity would have turned into something more akin to the Confederacy of Earth or the Terran Empire under a regime like that. Putting an absolute fascist right-wing nutjob like Hitler algorithm in charge of humanity, or even the Japanese Emperor, or anyone like that, would have been madness at that time period. The human race would have been had a very different outcome, and who knows what that would have done. And yeah, that was a good plan in their head, but whatever, maybe they had plans to undo it at a future event, or maybe they knew that even though they'd helped the Nazis, stupid algorithm, that they wouldn't necessarily have a problem because they still weren't going to win. Maybe 10 years later they'd be defeated, they destroyed themselves, whatever. But that's kind of where he left it with Archer. He dumps him in the past, has him clean up the mess, but then the whole Temporal Cold War is fixed. Now we know from more recent events, about 100 years down the line, that the Temporal Cold War is still in swing. That means Daniels was either incorrect, or more accurately, I believe, lied to Archer. The Temporal Cold War was not coming to a conclusion. They'd eliminated one faction, maybe a serious one, yes, but only one faction. The Cold War was still going on, and Archer, he just wanted him out of it. He didn't want the Enterprise interfering in it. He didn't want Archer endangered any further. My guess would be the events of the Xindi War in this instance. It had put Archer and the Enterprise in too much danger. Without them, the Federation would never exist. So therefore, he had to get them out of it. And I think he lied to accomplish that goal. We don't see anything else of Daniels after this point, but I want to hear all your thoughts about Daniels. I've talked about him in other episodes, about how we don't really know whether he was truly on the side of angels. He could have been the bad guy and we just didn't know. We're talking about a person who's displaced in time, and we're literally having to believe his story. Now, everything he does seems to point towards he is Federation. But what are your thoughts on this, man? I want to hear them. Put them in the comments down below, and like, share and subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this episode. There are several more in the Time War playlist that are created already, but as of right now, that's the end of this particular series. I may patch additional episodes to it in the future, but again, I want to hear your thoughts, because he is something of a magnanimous figure. We don't know much about him, only what we hear from him And based on his actions, he superficially seems good, but remember, Silic saved the Enterprise once as well. Just saying, devil's advocate. It's possible he's the bad guy.